On Autofiles, we look at the cars that Ford built to beat Ferrari and win at Le Mans in the 1960s, the Ford GT. The cars were better known as GT40s because they were 40 inches high. 4 versions were built with a variety of engine sizes and a massive list of drivers employed in the big races of the day. Watkins Glen in upstate New York celebrated the 20th anniversary of Ford's 4th Le Mans win in 1989. One driver who was sampling the GT40 was Sterling Moss.
Well, it's too much of a youngster. I mean, this wasn't actually built until about 5 or 6 years after I retired, because I didn't race professionally after '62, and of course GT40s didn't exist. So it's my first taste of it, and I must say they're quick. It's not an easy car because the throttle response is a little difficult. I enjoy it. I'm learning something all the time. I think the more mileage I can do, I've only had about an hour so far, the more I can do, the more I'm learning to try and get round the few little problems that it offers. But I'm enjoying it. It's a sensational circuit, and as it's in Italian, it's a bit like that with this car. It's fast.
How did Moss, noted for his car control, find the balance in the GT40?
Oh, I think it's a beautifully balanced car, but the problem of the throttle, you see, is when you want to, when I'm driving and I'm going around, say, a left or right-hander, I like to bring the throttle in gently to hold the car in. And this car feels as though it would do that, but of course I can't get the throttle to come in that easily, and it makes it a little bit more nervous, if you like.
He was watching at close hand drivers like Jackie Ickx and Brian Redman, something he didn't have the opportunity to do when he was driving because their careers came after he had retired. Did he observe that the driving style had changed a lot, particularly with someone like Brian, who was still driving professionally in 1989?
I haven't really had the chance to see him because he was behind me in the practice earlier, and so I haven't seen him in front when I used to see them, because the view out of the back of these cars is not the greatest, I can tell you. You don't see much. I look forward to it. I have a great respect for both of them. Obviously, Jackie is not as competitive at the moment as Brian is, or at least he doesn't do this sort of racing as much. It's going to be it's obviously going to be quite a tough race, though.
Concentration required to drive a powerful car like the GT40 is immense. How does Moss approach a car like this?
Let's put it this way, it doesn't come as easily as it did. I seem to remember in my career, when I was racing all the time, that concentration was not something I had to bother about. You know, I automatically concentrated. I think that now I do need to, you know, really sort of tighten down the bolts a bit. I know that when I wanted to go really quickly, when I was racing professionally, I'd say, well, now I'm going to really try this lap and, you know, brake a little later, accelerate a bit earlier, those sort of things. Now, of course, I have to do that all the time. My threshold of fear is a lot closer. When I go up through the S's up there, I notice that the Armco seems to step in closer as I'm going faster, and it isn't as easy. It doesn't come as easily as I'm sure it did when I was 20 or 30 years younger.
What about the enjoyment factor? Is that still there?
The great enjoyment factor now really is being here. The people, the atmosphere, the climate, the cars, driving them. But the whole thing is a big deal. When I was racing before, the pleasure came in mostly in the getting out on the track and competing. Now I get a lot of pleasure from meeting the people, and before I go on the track, after I come off the track, and while I'm on the track. So it's a longer and more spread thing.
The GT40 demonstration at Watkins Glen saw the track covered with these splendid sports cars of the 60s in all their varieties. The blue and orange John Wyer automotive cars, including the famous Mk6 with 2 Le Mans wins to its credit, driven here by Brian Redman. While we watch the cars on the circuit, let's run through the GT40 story. During the early part of the 1960s, Ford attempted to buy Ferrari for $18 million to run its international racing program. The intention was to use the Ferrari company and technology to help Ford achieve a Le Mans victory. But the negotiations unraveled and Ferrari walked away from the table in May 1963. Roy Lunn was an Englishman who had begun his career at Ford of Britain and went to the United States in 1958. He'd played a role in helping to create the 1962 mid-engined Ford Mustang I concept. After the Mustang won, Roy Lunn, along with Ray Geddes and Donald Frey, turned their attention to a racing program. The car that Ford conceived was similar to the Lola GT, low and mid-engined. The Lola was designed and built by Eric Broadley in England and first displayed in January of 1963 at the London Racing Car Show. Broadley was running low on funds and was more than eager to join in with Ford. Borrowed from the Lola GT was the monocoque centre section and aerodynamic design. It was longer, wider and stronger with a rigid steel section. In the midsection lay an all-aluminium 4.2-litre V8 engine. The gearbox was a 4-speed Italian Colotti unit. The suspension was double wishbone. Excellent stopping power was provided by the 11.5-inch disc brakes on all 4 wheels. In April 1964, the GT40 was displayed to the public at the New York Auto Show. And 2 weeks later, the car was at Le Mans being put through pre-race testing. The result of a very rushed program was evident. The car suffered from aerodynamic and stability issues and as a result ended in 2 crashes. The GT represented Gran Turismo, while the designation 40 represented its height, only 40 inches. The number 40 was added when the Mk II was introduced. The Mk II, built in England, was put through extensive testing which solved many of the stability issues. Carroll Shelby was brought on board to oversee the racing program. He began by installing a 7-litre NASCAR engine that was more powerful and more reliable. The result was a vehicle that was much more stable and quicker than the Mk I. For the 1965 Le Mans 24-hour, the Mk II proved to be a stronger contender, but resulted in another unsuccessful campaign. The Lola T70 Mk III was Eric Broadley's development of the theme that had started the GT40. One, fitted with an Aston Martin engine, was fastest in practice for Le Mans at that time. Bob Bondurant, Jackie Ickx and Brian Redman discussing the racing scene with Moss and Carroll Smith, who was involved in building the cars. Ickx looks on in the sunshine. We speak to Brian Redman.
Well, in the GT40, at least the one that Jackie Ickx and I are driving this weekend, which is the Mk II with a 7-litre engine, it weighs almost 3,000 pounds. It's got very little aerodynamic aids. In other words, it does not have ground effect like a modern Aston Martin or Group C racing car does. It weighs 1,000 pounds more, and the power is about the same. So there is a huge, huge difference. This is 20 years of development that we're looking at in the Group C Aston Martin against this 1967 Mk II Ford GT40. What this means in practical terms is that when you come to a corner, the braking on this heavier, older car, you've really got to brake early, and the car's like this a little bit, and you think, you know. In the Group C car, you brake what seems to be unbelievably late. You hurtle into the corner and you just go bang like that, and the thing goes, and it doesn't do anything. It just stops, and then you turn, and it's got ground effect pulling it onto the ground, and it screams through the corner, and your head goes like this, you know, because of the G-force. Now, in these older cars, they are older cars. We're looking at 20+ years.
Redman also raced Porsches and Chevrons as well as the GT40s that came in between. How good was the GT40?
Well, look, the GT40 was a brilliant car, and it became a brilliant car because of the influence and the money and the technical and engineering ability of the Ford Motor Company. The car actually started life as a Lola GT, which was built by Eric Broadley in England, and the rights were bought by the Ford Motor Company, and development then took place. And of course, under both Ford themselves with the Mk II and the Mk IV, and after that with John Wyer, with the earlier car, but in much later form, with wider wheels and with much less weight, was also highly successful.
Driving for John Wyer, for Porsche and for Aston Martin, did he notice any change in management style over the years?
Now, the style of management of the teams has changed quite a lot, because today there are immense commercial and financial pressures on the teams, and this is reflected in every aspect of it, from top management down to the man that sweeps the garage floor. Today, as in all sports, it doesn't matter what it is, the pressure is far greater, and in practical terms that means that 20 years ago, driving for John Wyer or for Porsche, any of the top teams, and John Wyer in particular, the style of life was very important. It was important to him and to the team that you stayed at the best hotels, that you ate at the best restaurants, and that everything was conducted in a relatively gentlemanly manner. Now today, that gentlemanly manner has gone by the board. It's how fast you go, how quickly you can do it, and how little they can pay you.
For an American driver to have an American car that was competitive must have been a wonderful feeling.
It was absolutely fantastic, because as an American being in Europe, starting out the Cobras and then the GT40s, it felt so good to be able to beat Ferrari. And in '65, as you know, we were fortunate enough to win the World Manufacturers Championship. And when you win over there, you get up at the podium and they play the national anthem. To hear the good old USA national anthem really gets you right here in the heart, makes you feel proud to be an American in an American-built car. And it's just fantastic.
What was it like to come back to these cars 20 years later and drive them again?
I've never driven a Ford GT40 Mark IV. I only tested and raced the Mark Is, so I hopped in a Mark IV the other day, and it felt almost like a Mark I, except, of course, you have more power and a little longer chassis, and it felt good to get used to it all over again. I like it.
The third generation of the GT40, the Mk III, was introduced in 1966, and only 7 were produced. Ford continued to fine-tune and prepare the GT40 for Le Mans. The GT40 led the 1966 race from the beginning. During the morning, the GT40s were ordered to reduce their speed for purposes of reliability. By noon, 20 hours into the race, 10 of the 13 Fords entered had been eliminated. The remaining 3 went on to capture first, second and third places, with New Zealanders Bruce McLaren and Chris Amon taking the victory. In 1967, Ford introduced the Mk IV to Le Mans. It was all American built, whereas the previous versions had been criticized as being English built and merely fueled by American money. Of the 7 vehicles Ford entered for Le Mans in 1967, 3 crashed during the nighttime hours. When the checkered flag dropped, it was the GT40 driven by Dan Gurney and AJ Foyt that beat the second and third place Ferraris by 4 laps. For 1968, the FIA put a limit on engine displacement at 5 litres. Ford left international sports car racing and sold the cars to John Wyer. The Gulf Oil Company provided sponsorship for the team to enter the 1968 Le Mans 24-hour. The Wyer team's Mk I GT40 emerged victorious in both 1968 and '69. In 1969, new FIA rules and regulations ultimately retired the GT40s from racing and ended their winning streak. Around 126 race and road-going Ford GT40s were produced during their production lifespan. Time to see and listen to the GT40s in action in the double-driver endurance race. Jackie X pressing on hard in number 18. Sterling Moss goes through in the now smoking Mk IV, a longer and sleeker car than the earlier models. Number 7 has a problem, oil being spread around the circuit. One GT40 certainly out of the running, but worse than that, it affects the state of the circuit. Australian Bib Stillwell still driving hard, as are X and Moss. Number 8 is the rare open GT40 prototype, built for Can-Am racing, but it didn't prove successful. With the oil flag out, the safety car comes onto the circuit. It's pit stop time, and drivers take the opportunity, while the yellow flag is out, to make their change. In comes Stillwell for Chris Lawrence to take over, as does the leading Lola Mk III. Meanwhile, more cement is spread on the oil, and X is in for Redmond to take over. Moss arrives at the same time for Bob Bondurant's turn at the wheel. Carol Smith directs operations. Moss and Bondurant exchange views as to the circuit and the condition of the car. Moss admits to not having driven hard. They're hoping to stay reliable throughout this long race. A problem for all long-distance races, which include more than one driver, is fitting people of different sizes comfortably into the same car. A push start for Brian Redman, and he's followed out by Bondurant, whose successful high-performance school has done so much for motorsport in the USA. The safety car returns to pit lane and the race is on again. Watkins Glen hosted the US Grand Prix from 1969 to 1981, but these days Indianapolis has a firm hold on that race. Brian Redman chased by Bob Bondurant. Brake lights show that Bondurant brakes the later of the two, but goes in on a wider line. Smoke is still pouring from the back of the Mk IV, and it's looking like the Bondurant-Moss race might be shorter than anticipated. Braking deep into the apex is one of the ways that Moss gained seconds in the past, and it's a lesson not forgotten when he's back at the wheel. Bib Stillwell's GT40 in the pits. Moss's car is out, and we talk to Brian Redman.
We haven't spoken to each other at all about any tactics or anything. We were too far apart at the dinner table last night, but we know what to do.
Seems working out quite well for your car.
Well, unfortunately, the clutch is broken, so we don't have a clutch, which means that sometimes you can't get a gear, which is awkward. And also in the pit stop, it wouldn't start. The engine wouldn't start, so we lost a minute there. So the car's running okay, so we just must see what happens, I think.
What happened to your car?
Drive shaft, I think. Well, the final drive. It just no drive through to the wheels.
You'd had a fairly dramatic pit stop prior to that.
Yeah, we've had a bit of problems with oil vapor and so on, and which is not completely cured, but was good enough. I think we were all set to go to the end if it could have done, and unfortunately the drive went. That was it.
So Moss's run is over, and so is the Serengeti Cup at Watkins Glen. The GT40 of Jackie Ickx hustles along, holding on to third place and trying to catch Stillwell in second and the Lola in the lead. The gathering at the Glen brought together cars from a famous era of racing for Ford, with the Anglo-American GT40 achieving the company's aims. In fact, the GT40 name is so revered that Ford released a new GT in 2003, confirming the popularity of the sports car.